So I'm Dan Fernandez. So while I'm currently on the Azure.Microsoft.com team, one of the key things, I've been working at Microsoft for like 18 years. It worked on C#, Visual Studio, Docker tools, Azure CLI. Jeff Sanquist at one point said, hey, we got to fix MSDN and TechNet. How many of you have ever been to MSDN and TechNet? OK, good show of hands. And how many of you have been to Docs or used Microsoft Learn? Any? Couple more hands. Edited a doc, meaning community contribution to any kind of doc. Couple hands up. And how many of you know how to raise your hand when asked? OK, about half the room. OK, good. So that's awesome. We're going to talk through a number of the different things that we did here. And it's kind of a story of conflict, murder, like we killed MSDN, not actual murder, and redemption and hope. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. All these slides are available. I'm not going to talk through everything here. We'll make it available just so you have it as a reference. So here's what we're going to talk about. Why do we even care about this space? A New Hope, our redemption story. Get into architecture. How do we build something when we need it to hit global scale? And right now, I think our number is 50 million unique customers a month, or 200 million page views a month. And how do we do that in a performant and cheap way using Azure? How we actually do a documentation, so your edit all the way to website. We'll go through that. How to use GitHub. And then some of the unique challenges with building things like API reference and Microsoft Learn. Cool? So exciting. I know, I know. It's standing room only. Jeez. There's a couple seats over here. If you'd like. OK, so why? Why do we even care about, do we care about documentation? Who cares about, right? Like this is kind of a common thing where it's like, all right, we're going to ship and then worry about this later. But it turns out all of you care. So when they do surveys, this is /data, and the 2017 and 2018 numbers are identical. Documentation sample code is the #1 most important thing to the developer audience. The #1 thing. Tutorials, which is #2. When you click into that, it's step-by-step learning, right? I'm going to start at 0 and build something. When you look at dzone, besides after the API, which of course, if you're a developer, if you don't have an API, yes, documentation is going to be #2. But it's the #2 most important thing. On the left-hand side, what you're seeing is open source developers. This is the GitHub survey that says the #1 problem in open source is documentation. And it's not just an open source thing. It's an enterprise thing. So Gartner Group, which does their Magic Quadrant, when we took over, they would call out why Microsoft is inferior to AWS and to Google Cloud Platform. Customers cite issues with documentation and training. This is enterprise, open source, the developer ecosystem in general. And again, Miguel, which has the most impact today, sit down and write documentation. So is it important? Yes. Yes, it is. So how do we get to this state? So MSDN and TechNet has been launching CDs. Anybody still have those CDs or remember them? Yeah, exactly. They're great on eBay, aren't they? So we've been doing this for a while. MSDN started as a website around, I think it was like 94, a couple years later. Then TechNet followed. And it was where we publish all of our documentation. But it was only documentation writers, proprietary formats. It was really hard for you to do. And this thing happened in between there. And maybe you all saw it. Blogs. When blogs happened, all Microsoft employees started blogging because it was that much easier to publish content. And when I say all Microsoft employees, we had 16,000 instances of blogs. Why? Because this could not scale. What also happened is teams had business requirements, right? So like you're not even getting to my change. It takes too long to get my stuff on the web. This is just a sampling of all the sites that existed when we started this effort, right? So many of you know ASP.NET had its own documentation on ASP.NET. ASP.NET Core had its own separate documentation using Read the Docs. So even teams within just the ASP.NET team, they had 2 different stacks for doing documentation. Scary. So what we decided to do was interview a number of customers, which is kind of that middle column. And we have reams and reams of data. We wrote an 8-page doc We stole Star Wars Episode 4 and called it A New Hope, right? Because it's not often you say we need to do a total rewrite, but that is what we said. We need a 10x better experience, and we need to treat docs just like OSS code. We have a huge problem. If you are a web developer that wants to build something on Azure with the database, you're going to 5 different websites. Entity Framework, their docs were hidden in their GitHub repo. ASP.NET Core was over here. SQL, well, it depends. Sometimes it was TechNet, sometimes it was MSDN. We don't even know how, right? This is the world we live in. One of the key things, too, when you're doing these projects is to measure the business outcomes, which is, what are you trying to do? Our docs will help you get there. And this was one of the areas where people, again, just kind of ignore docs and the importance of docs. All of us, at some point, have had to evaluate between A, B, and C technology. And you do the Pepsi challenge. You open up a browser, you open up a bunch of tabs, and you're choosing between which one is which. Maybe you're looking at some third-party independent things. This is what our customers did. And they land on these MSDN pages. The samples don't work. It's out of date. It's incorrect. Or they can't find it. They're not going to choose us, right? It's directly tied. And we started adding ways to measure this through analytics. And then we had what's called MOM. Jennifer Meshkowski and her team had the mother of all migrations, which is 45 million documents that they had to migrate from MSDN and TechNet. Either migrate, archive, or retire. And when I give you kind of an example, Visual Studio, what they did is every release, they copied every single doc. So Visual Studio 2008, 25,000 docs. 2010, 2012, 2013, 2015. They're all the same docs. And in many cases, the docs haven't even changed, right? But we literally have copies of these things, which actually ruins our SEO. And Visual Studio 2012, for whatever reason, had the highest SEO, so nobody could even find the 2015 docs. I know many of you have kind of faced this. So unreadable URLs. This is my personal passion. Our URLs were terrible. There's just a number of things that we really wanted to do and improve here. And we got approval and buy-off to do this. And one of the key things, though, that we wanted to do was set boundaries. So we're not going to be some white-label documentation solution where everybody can just put it on their own domain. Because now we have great docs, but we still have the 30-plus different websites everywhere. Second, we want to have some level of consistency, right? We're not GoDaddy where you can host and put anything you want in terms of HTML and CSS. We're going to have consistency, so when you go from one product to another, there's some level of consistency. So everything I'm going to talk about is more the technical issues that go into this. I wanted to leave one slide because, as we all know, convincing people to do other things is probably the harder part, not the technical part. And convincing people to bet on MSDN and TechNet when we haven't been was probably the biggest challenge of this project. And what we did was start small. We did a pilot and showed just how much better that 10x experience was. And you got to watch for defensiveness, where it's like, I don't want to do your thing, or we have unique requirements. Or maybe they're just comfortable. They don't actually want to change. They don't want to relinquish control, and you have to be aware of those things. Now, during this time is the Satya era, where we're going to be one Microsoft. And I say one Microsoft, but not ironically. But I think that was one of the challenges. We wanted to be open source everywhere. And that was our goal, because we're going to treat docs just like we do code. Everything's going to be open source. And there's a lot of teams that were worried. We had general managers saying, why would I want my docs, and I was almost going to give away the product, to be open source? And you have to get there, and you have to convince them. Now, part of that is hearts. All those different websites that I mentioned weren't localized. How many people English wasn't their first language? Look how many hands. Just take a second. There's a lot of hands up where English wasn't their first language. Now, I know some of you, JavaScript was probably your first language, but and I'm so sorry for that. But all these different websites didn't have localization. So literally, it was you had to fight through English docs, and that's really hard. So we did a number of things that I'll talk about. And then empowerment, which is, it's not just the writing team that can do docs, it's our community. It's our program managers. The own people on the teams couldn't write docs. How do we enable it and empower anybody to create docs? And then the other thing, which is kind of the well actually, where people will try and get you, right? Well, what's it going to cost? All those resources you had building websites, you don't need them anymore. So put them wherever you want. It costs $0. We'll give you better analytics. the performance is going to be 4x better, 400% performance increase just on page load. We'll help migrate, that mother of all migrations in Jennifer Meshkowski's team. Here's what our customers are saying. There's no impact. And we have 24/7 support. Even then, people were still hesitant. And that's why you have to listen to those other things. And this happens in any kind of IT project when you're trying to go big and say, we're going to unify the company towards one direction. OK, enough babble. Let's show demos. Demos. Are you all excited? I'm so excited. OK, what's the heart rate? What do we got? Oh, it's at 80. Oh, geez. OK. All right, can everybody see OK? Folks in the back? OK. I will zoom in every now and then just to make it easy. So right now we're at the Azure homepage, and we build these pages. And I'm just going to go into a piece of documentation here. Couple things to kind of call out. One is I'm going to just drag this. It works on mobile. It's responsive. Ooh, it wasn't before, let me tell you. This is a filter by title. So if you know you're looking for something like container instances, it's going to search that tree for all the things that you want. And I'll just kind of zoom in there so you can see, as I typed, it actually gave me that thing. So I clicked to that page. I'm now on a page. Now, we'll talk about some of the different techniques here, but we have things like being able to check, is something helpful or not that we can rate or not rate. This, in this article, is dynamically created based on the H2s on the page. So you, as a content developer, didn't need to worry about that. You just set what the H2s are, and you're good to go. Bookmark, you can now bookmark pages. So it's like, hey, I want to remember that. You have all your bookmarks. I'll talk about feedback in a second, but then themes. Yeah, dark theme. Ooh, we can do CSS. It's so exciting, huh? High contrast, again, for accessibility, which is a great example of something that we can do for inclusive design. So I'm just going to go down the page. This is all Markdown, but a couple things here. What if we think about developers? What if you could actually run code directly in a browser? Do you want to download the Azure? If you're doing that Pepsi Challenge test drive of a thing, I'm just going to click Try It. And with the demo gods working, this is going to sign me in, or it should sign me in. I'm going to choose my account, and it's going to create Azure Cloud Shell, which is basically a real shell that I can call in the browser, and I can manage my entire Azure resources and resource groups and create resources directly from the browser. So cool. OK, so I'm going to give this a second to load. And while that's going, and we'll be able to go back there, I'm also going to click Edit to just get that page up and going. We'll go back to our try it. And since we're nice about that, there it is. It's nice and ready. So this is a real shell. So, you know, AL. OK, that's the extent of my Linux knowledge. OK, so I'm going to click Copy, as all good developers, and just, you know, create a resource group. And maybe we'll say my resource group 5, and maybe Australia Central to make it a little closer. Central. OK, so what we've done here is we set location Australia Central. I click Run, and with any luck, this will actually create a resource group named My Resource Group 5 in Australia. And boom, there it is, created. This is in documentation. I haven't done anything. I haven't downloaded anything. And we'll talk about the power of containers, but it really is environments as a service. If you have a bunch of stuff configured, a specific SDK, maybe a download of a sample app, you build that environment, and now you can use it directly in the browser. OK, so that's kind of our simple example. And what's actually going on under the covers? So I clicked Edit, and we are in an open source GitHub repo. And I'm going to go ahead and click Edit. And what I'll do is this, underneath the covers, is the actual contents of the file. Right? So let's, can you all see this? Is that OK? So the title goes in here. There's metadata, which is key value pairs at the top. And then it's just Markdown. And when I say it's Markdown, you can, again, just go to the preview changes, and it just shows you what the page is going to look like, right? So how complicated is it for you to add interactivity for that? Let's go down to that. You basically say backtick 3 times Azure CLI interactive, right? Azure CLI interactive. It's that easy, right? And at that point, what we're doing is I want to run that sample and say, try it, build an experience that lets me run code. Now, all this is available, and we'll go through a couple other things quickly here. All using the power of GitHub. So when you actually made that change, it's not like Wikipedia where you make a change and all of a sudden Dan is the president of the United States. Everything goes through a fork, which is my copy, and then the team has to accept it. And when they accept it, then I become the president of the United States. That's how it works. But the point is, if you're defacing something, you're only defacing your copy. So that workflow of, I'm going to submit a pull request, and that pull request goes through. We actually run a bunch of automation to make sure, hey, is your links broken? Did you forget a title? Did you forget a description? What's wrong with you? So those things that we all add into our CI to make us feel really guilty about our quality, those are all within there. This other thing that I wanted to show was GitHub issues. So again, how do we treat documentation as a product? If you see down here, and is this helpful, me zooming in here? Is this, yeah? OK, so you see an open or closed. You can open an issue on a piece of documentation that opens a GitHub issue already, right? And we'll talk about what that means. But I'm just going to go through one example. Hey, what are the requirements, restrictions for a DNS label? You know, is there a max length? Here's kind of the customer question. You can see the comments. And you know, he goes back and says, hey, it's all documented here. So when you get stuck, one of the key things we want to do is help you get unstuck. Here's the solution. You can try, and it's helpful for us, right? Because we can say, where are people getting stuck in there's issues? We don't have this document. The other big thing was the virtuous cycle. That means, hey, there's some issue. The link is broken. You don't have documentation for how these labels work. You'll get a notification when we fixed it. And that'll make you much more likely to do it again. Wow, they're listening to me. They're actually fixing this stuff. And again, you can also submit your own fixes as well. And this is all using the power. And I'll show you the great project this is based on that does a lot of this work for you automatically. OK. So showed kind of a high-level demo. Let's talk about some of the architecture. What's involved in building this stuff? So this is the eye chart, if you will, in terms of all the things that you typically have to go to. But when we're thinking about building a solution, it has, you know, to scale to millions that are geographically diverse. It has to be up, right? So if something like the Azure docs go down, that would be not good for as a career move. We'll talk about the JAMStack, JavaScript APIs and Markup, on the next page. But that really is how we get that scale. And then horizontal scale out, which we're all probably familiar with it, which is, hey, I'm not going to have one big massive server. I'm going to have a bunch of stateless servers that I can scale up or scale down as needed. And we copy that model for web hosting. We copy it for build. And we even copy it for GitHub repos, that scale out model. A couple other things is the very first version, before we went into that GitHub issues feedback that you just saw, we actually had live fire comments on the docs. And one of the issues we ran into is live fire comments actually went down. Our docs didn't throw a 500 error. What we did was just basically not show that div. So how do you assume, back to the resilience, how do you assume things are going to go down and you're OK with that, especially in a microservices world where you're getting data from third parties, from first parties, that what they call graceful degradation of the experience. A couple other things that you all can see here. The other one is Akamai forward URL rewriting. That is a great tool when we have a bunch of different teams that actually want to use their own software, but we want to have the URL we want, where it basically allows you to keep the URL you want, and in /Azure/ASP/whatever, it can actually point to completely different websites. So that was very helpful to kind of control those things on that. And at the same time, for file paths, for URLs, for docs, we just use whatever the GitHub file path is. So if there was a, Azure docs was a directory, then containers, then the actual markdown file, that's the URL. Don't do this weird mapping and routing. the simple solution sometimes is kind of awesome. OK. And then eventual consistency for some things like building the PDF. It can be, take a minute after. It doesn't have to be coupled with the link, search results, and so on. OK, JAMStack. So what this is static pages. And I say static, meaning kind of the HTML. We'll talk about exactly what it means in the fragments. But it uses dynamism through API calls and JavaScript. And we've seen this already. Like you could argue that any React app, if you will, or Angular app, or any of these kind of front-end networks kind of follows this model. The difference is really the markup, which is it's created markup at build time. So it builds these pages. And as a random thing, Scott called out just today about, hey, I need a cloud scale database. The data changes once a month. We have no money. A JSON file in cloud storage. Everything we do actually ends up being either markdown files, JSON, or YAML in file storage. We don't necessarily need a database to store all this stuff. We don't have to pay the database cost. And it's actually way cheaper than 2 cents. So one click more. We're all developers. I picked ASP.NET MVC. This could really be any sort of MVC page that follows the same model. But that's kind of the server-side generated is on the left. And then static site generators, or JAMStack, is on the right. So I'm showing Markdown and Liquid, which is what Docs uses, which is what Jekyll uses. Jekyll being what GitHub built. And if you're using Markdown by default on GitHub, that's what it uses. But this could be anything. There's static site generators in every language of your choice. Node.js, Python, ASP.NET. I have links to them. Really, I'm telling you to choose JAMStack, which is framework agnostic. Not necessarily say use this framework, this framework. You must choose Vue. You must choose React. There's different static site generators for both of those, for example. OK, on the left, we see what's called a model, which is basically a description of a movie. It has a title, a release date, a genre. We also have a content model. So this is a really basic one, which is key value pairs. Key, value, title is quick start, used Azure CLI, date, author, and so on. And then the actual body, which is markdown, right? So when we talk about templating, what happens is the build takes this stuff, and it's going to return a model. Part of the model converts this markdown into HTML. So the model includes this thing called content, which you see here, which is the actual content of the file. And then what we basically do is very similar to here. We are going to loop. In this case, we're showing contributors. We're going to loop through all the contributors and basically display their image. We're going to loop through every movie and display the movie metadata. These are the same concept, but and then we spit stuff out. So on the output there, here we see the title is actually different. This one ends in create a Linux VM, which is the page title, is different than the H1, which ends with Azure CLI, which is the page here. And then we see our wonderful images there. Here's the difference. Every single request to a page, this code runs. Every single request. Once per build. Right? So if we're making those changes and we think about, well, we have so many changes. Our build system runs, I think, every 2 to 4 seconds, we're doing a new build. Right? And I'll talk about some of the different things here and how we partition those out. And by the way, GitHub, if your stuff is free, they'll do the builds for you. So again, even the build CPU cost will be free to you. And the hosting, everything we're doing is basically showing static content, HTML, on a CDN. The thing that's dynamic is, of course, the most important part, which is the services, the microservices themselves. So the auth, the data, and so on, and all that works. And you're just basically wasting CPU for what is, things that aren't necessarily going to change. OK, so here's kind of, we did our quick start hello world markdown page. Now what actually happens in GitHub and build. So I did my fork. Remember, we are forking. We submit a pull request. It has a bunch of things. And there's a webhook into our system. And that's going to say, I want you to build a new version based on the pull request. So you can preview the pull request in that environment. What it does is it's going to clone my docs run our tool, and this can be any tool that you want. In this case, it's our docfx, which is what we use. Docfx.json being the config file that says, here's how I want this build to work. The same things we saw before. It's going to build a model. It's going to apply the template and spit out HTML fragments into blob storage. Right? A couple other magic things that we have. One, you can preview any branch. So if people put branches in here, we do use Azure Active Directory. So you can't necessarily see things that are secrets that haven't launched yet. A live branch, which is unique to docs, which is really that represents live. So if you ever need to roll back, you just basically push whatever branch you want. OK. We applied the template. We got one file. Now, what's the customer experience? So we are here, right? We just did the cloud build. And again, these can be partitioned. We can have thousands of builds going on within here. And they're all writing to different places in blob storage. But let's start on the left side, which is a customer visits that Azure page. First, we check the cache. Is it hitting Akamai CDN? If it is, we're just going to return the page and not do any compute whatsoever. We do have very lightweight, and this doesn't do a lot of computation, but it basically does a lookup, especially because we had to add things like redirection, and says, when I see URL, just pull the HTML fragment from this place in blob storage. And that's it. And obviously, we do app insights and analytics, tracking business outcomes, et cetera, et cetera. And a couple of other things that we do in the liquid templates to do things like changing headers and so on. OK, so now we have one site that we built. Now that scale out model, I picked 3 here. When you go to these 3 different URLs, they're actually built from 3 different or more repos. Right? ASP.NET Core is completely open source. It doesn't have the thing on the bottom, which is a private repo. Right? Anything, if you really want to follow it, ASP.NET Core, look at those branches. There's a bunch of cool stuff that I didn't even know was shipping. It's always fun to watch. But Azure, you can imagine before a product release, they want to be able to have intro to our new service. You don't necessarily want to put that in a public, so they put it in private, which is the -PR to represent private. And then at that conference, hey, we did the conference. Scott Guthrie's on stage. Boom, then we merge it back into the public Azure Docs. And because these are scaled, we have thousands of these repos. The build can be scaled. The repos can be scaled. And you get to use whatever repo you want. Yes, you have to put our config in that, but that's how we get to the level of affordability or cheaper cost. And we are like, I think we saved like $7 million. Actually, it's higher than that in terms of total costs for this. And frankly, we should probably be doing more GitHub builds and forcing that team to pay the bill, and it'd be a lot cheaper. But the moral of this story, incredibly scalable. And Akamai CDN, Azure Front Door didn't exist when we originally did this project. But it has over 120 different places. So your actual time to get a page is way faster. OK. Lessons learned. So one of the key pains that we ran into with static site generators, they build the entire page. I mean, the entire page. Right? The problem was our team wanted to change the Chrome, the outside parts. And because those were built, say 20,000 times for each of those pages, you can't change those. So what we did was have the Chrome be dynamic, and the middle red part, that's what our build system is going to do, that HTML fragment, if you will, that's actually the actual content of the article. So the build system basically says, and these static site generators, and again, it really depends on how big a problem you're talking about. When we're talking about 45 million docs and people going to different pages and they're actually different Chrome, that's a problem. If you have less than 1,000, maybe this isn't a problem at all. But kind of to our scale, and based on this stuff, decouple the Chrome from content. So we can add things like high contrast. OK, so GitHub. I mentioned and showed the GitHub feedback. This is one of my favorite comments. It was actually from Jay Phelps at Netflix when we were interviewing and starting the New Hope. He said, MSDN, there's no way to tell anyone. It's a black hole of feedback. That's what he called anytime there was feedback and you'd set it on MSDN, and I was like, I need t-shirts. I want to build a band named Black Hole of Feedback. It was great, and it really helped cement what we need to do to improve this experience for customers. So the first thing we tried was on the left, which is live fire comments. And that ended up being a wall of text of comments. And it's really hard to track, is this comment like, great job? Or is there an issue in the 3rd thread on the 7th comment? It's really hard to track. What are we used to? Work item tracking, right? So we were able to use GitHub issues, as you saw before. I can define a state. I can route customers. Is it product feedback? Go here, which is the user voice. So that way it can go into that black hole. And then, kidding. A little. You can assign users. You can set labels. And I mentioned that virtuous cycle. So this is the project, Utterances, by Jeremy Daniel. And it's available. You can do this for anything, right? A number of people are using it for blogs to add comments. And again, because it's GitHub issues, it's free. On the DevOps side, so our deployment, we do CI/CD. All our stuff is in GitHub. We use Azure DevOps for the CI pipeline. We have multiple environments. We do web app slots. And then UX automation, we've done a number of things to basically make sure there aren't regressions, that make sure that things like our accessibility tests are passing and so on. And then one of the key things is how we get to making changes quickly, independent deployments. So that UX templates, the Chrome, they ship at least daily, sometimes multiple times a day. But they're not forced to wait on the bigger train, which is the DocFX build engine. That can ship when it wants to, and it's about every 3 weeks. And then every microservice can ship whenever it wants to. Right? They're completely decoupled, following a lot of the same microservices patterns. And they have their private data. Right? So it's not some shared database that we're continuously kind of overwriting our schemas and so on. GitHub and community. There's a number of lessons learned here on the content side. I'm just going to show this kind of as an example. But things like make sure you have a code of conduct. Add things like the up for grabs label when you want the community to contribute to, and so on and so forth. Recognize contributors. It's really important. OK, you saw that large number of hands on people that didn't learn, that English wasn't their first language. One of the biggest things we wanted to do was have fantastic support for localization. So we actually support 65+ languages, including right-to-left languages. But the best part, but wait, there's more, is let's say I'm a developer in Poland. I'm looking at the PLPL, the Polish version of a doc. There's something incorrect. Maybe there's a typo. There's something incorrect, a typo, and a broken link. I submit my pull request to the Polish repo. They fix it, and now Polish is fixed. But it cascades up. So that means English, all those changes go, hey, the link is broken, and we're using the wrong term on English as well. So they fix English, which cascades down to every single language. So you as a Polish developer actually improve the docs for every single language in the world. All right, I have to drop the mic now. OK, no. That's huge. How do we make somebody's contribution that much more valuable? By making it global and scale. And all of this is done through GitHub and GitHub automation. OK, so who cares about docs? Do our customers at all? We have 2,000 public doc repositories. I mentioned how we scale out. And that's just in the Microsoft Docs organization. There's many more. But here's the crazy part. This is from GitHub's Octoverse, where it's like the state of GitHub. The #1 project on all GitHub is Visual Studio Code. The #5 is Azure Docs. We're better than Kubernetes? Yeah, that's awesome. We're the fastest growing repo. I mentioned it's all those community enablement features that we added to be able to do that. And they're all available, and everybody can take advantage of this. It's huge, and it just shows the community wants to help each other and help make it better. And it's beautiful. Sorry, OK, what am I at now? Oh, God, I'm like 90. Oh, OK, so exciting. OK, API reference is really a separate animal. And what I mean by that is, one, you got to remember MSDN and TechNet. We didn't even have that great automation for .NET. We didn't support all sorts of languages. Java, Python, TypeScript, which is different than JavaScript, Swagger for REST APIs, Quantum. What? So we want to go from a completely manual process that takes weeks to automated process. A dev does something, it shows on a website in minutes. So one of the key things we did was we built a cross-language JSON schema that basically represents how programming languages work. A programming language, it has some sort of type. A type has a name. It has an input, and when you call that input, it returns an output. Those sort of things are common across all programming languages. Some might even have type information, like, this is a string. Some might not, right? They're loosely typed, and so on. And we call that schema document processor. It is an open specification. And we added that as well as versioning. So I mentioned the pains on Visual Studio 2012. We added a bunch of deep versioning support that I'll show you. And examples first. So we actually just did like a screenshot of what it's like to go through system.string. You had to go down 28 page downs. The 28th page is the first example, because there's so many properties and methods and signatures. So what we did was basically change it around. Examples first. And people love that. They're like, oh my god, this example is here. They couldn't even find it, because after the 23rd page down, you're like, all right, I'm just going to go to Stack Overflow, which isn't necessarily wrong. And just a couple of things when you talk about the scale. We used to be a company that shipped every 2 years, every 1 year, now like every month. We have 90,000 new releases in the last 9 months. I mean, I know all of you have looked at the first 60,000, but 90,000 releases of new APIs. That's a lot of stuff, and we need to be able to scale that out. And 15 million docs. OK, so here's what it looks like from the pipeline. One of the key things we needed to do, especially for .NET, was our first tools, and the ones that are on DocFX today, looked at source code. But we switched that to use packages, meaning using a tool that Xamarin, when we had acquired Xamarin during this project, we used their tool called mdoc, and I have it in the links, that looks at, it does a reflection based on their DLLs and their NuGet packages. And the reason we switched is because source code won't tell you what things are available in a specific release. Because a lot of times people do build steps and say, hey, this API or this method isn't going to be in .NET Standard. This one's in Framework. This one's in .NET 4.5, et cetera, et cetera. So there's specific commands where what you really want to do is look at the output. Don't start with source. You're building something. This is the 4.8 version. This is the .NET Core version. And then look at the APIs that exist there. This is especially true when you have a lawsuit in Europe that says you must document your APIs, like some of us on stage do. And the package source code, this all goes through kind of well-known packages. And that schema document processor is that one JSON file. And once we get to that thing, it was really easy to do the rest, which is I now have a structure, and I'm going to apply a template, just like I did before with that movies model and those other models. Then another thing, which is we used to have APIs everywhere. Every team kind of put their own hidden thing. We said, if it's a language API, what if there was one place to find all REST APIs at Microsoft, or all Java APIs, or all Python APIs, or all PowerShell, or all .NET? So everything under, every API that we ship is under /.NET/API, and then the method signature. So you always know where to go. The URL is just basically the fully qualified type. And you can see things. The other key thing, how do we make this the experience the customers expect? It behaves just like IntelliSense. So I do system.string, and it gives me the results. And I'll show that in a second. And then here's kind of how the microservice works. We crawl all of the source files that are spit out by that schema document processor, throw it into Cosmos DB, and our search indexer, which is what Azure Search expects. And then we have a REST API that JAMStack page basically calls and says, hey, as I'm typing, I want you to return results. OK, enough talking. Let's show another demo. OK, so this is the .NET API browser. And when we talk about versioning support, one of the biggest pains is I don't want you to show me the latest. Our company has been on this version, and I need to be able to see this version. So just to show this, all APIs, and this is all APIs. There's a lot of APIs here. But how about just .NET Framework? And you get to pick which version of the API. So you know when that trustworthy docs, we know that that's the exact API that's shipped in that version. So let's keep all APIs. And I'm just going to type COLL and pray to the network gods. And I see, I'm going to just increase the browser size. Is that better for you guys? Yeah? OK, so I type COLL, and I see a bunch of collections. Some of you may not even know that the real-time collaboration team had their own collections, or that we had immutable collections, or that we had concurrent collections. Right? We're now able to see things that we didn't even know existed across all these teams. Oh, God. OK, are they locking the doors, too? Great. OK. All of you are going to submit docs right now. OK. Thank you for that, by the way. So let's just go look at a specific namespace. I'll let this load. And again, that was calling that REST API. But we had the same experience where you can switch versions directly here, or that same search experience, right? So I'll just do system.string. And let's go to the system.string class. You can, of course, change the language for whatever programming language you want. And you start seeing examples. Here's the cool part. You can just run this directly here. Let me actually just jump to here's another thing I just want to show real quick. This used to be just a wall of text of types, interfaces, constructors, everything. What we did was basically group them. So fields are in one place, properties are here, methods are here, operators are here. Just those simple things to help it easier for you to navigate those items. So I'm just going to do string.format. Real quick, I see all the different overloads, and I see links to my examples. So I'm going to click Run here, and with any luck, this will call what's called .NET Try It, another version of a container as an environment that I can run code. And while that's going, because that's going to be a little slower than I expected, I'm going to switch over to the Azure CLI. So now what we're showing, the Azure CLI is a way to basically run commands to manage Azure. We have the same capability we showed here. So I'm just going to do VM create. I see that there's a dev test lab, a SQL. I'm going to click virtual machines. And I see this colorization. Again, another open source project you all can use. I do the try it that we had before, and there's a bunch of examples. But I'm going to click edit. And this edit's a little unique, right? Instead of going to a Microsoft Docs repo, we are going to the product. So I'm going to say this again because it might be a little confusing. You can actually ship code inside products. You click edit. Here's the exact same content that you saw before in the examples. You make a change here. Your PR, you're not just fixing our docs. You're fixing the product. So the next time the Azure CLI release, your sample's in there. If you're a PowerShell person, you can go into the Windows PowerShell, a Windows Server PowerShell, get an example added. It'll ship in Windows. It's the easiest way to ship in Windows, right? This is the power of having kind of that one source of truth, having it be open source, and making it better for everyone. So, OK, so enough stall tactics. We're now at a code area. Let me see if I can see this. OK, so we have, it's using string.format. You never use string.format. You don't actually know how to format it. And I see an example here. This is ounces, which is a very American term. Now, I went to American public school, and I know for a fact this is kilometers. Sorry, I made a mistake. Sorry, let's $, of course. OK. So I click run. This is running a REPL. I can run code directly in my browser. You want to test an API? This is awesome. And I'm just going to do, let's do over here console. Look at this, IntelliSense in the browser. It's a brave new world. OK. So that's .NET APIs. Able to search millions, every single API that we have in one place, every single version in one place. Azure CLI, we're able to actually make changes into the product, so not just documentation. REST APIs. So if you are using any REST APIs, and I'm just going to do a quick search for a resource. This is just another example. And this is actually going to log me in to my Azure. This is documentation, but it's kind of exactly what a dev needs, right? How do I call this exact REST call? I'm going to log into my Azure account. I'm going to pick the subscription that I want to call this in. And it's going to tell me exactly what many of you have used tools like Postman. Postman, anyone? OK, Bueller. All right, good. See, our hands are still working. This is Postman that you can walk up and use any API. You can manage your stuff. So, hey, let me just test and make sure this works. And I see all the things that I built. Cool. OK, so let's jump back to slides. What are we at? OK, 67. Calm down, which is surprising. OK, Microsoft Learn. Erin Rifkin and I, after we had done docs, she joined from Amazon, and she had done training and certification there. We really wanted to kind of reimagine a learning experience for Microsoft. So we wrote a doc, kind of co-authored a doc, the same way we had done with New Hope. It was like, how do we reimagine the learning experience? And we had a bunch of problems, like incorrect, inconsistent. This is like frustrating for customers. Out of date, the Microsoft research team built a bunch of stuff for Azure for researchers. It was awesome until it stopped working. So you're a researcher at some university. You go walk up and nothing works. You're like, Azure sucks, right? And then duplication. This eye chart, every single logo here is a separate website dedicated to either employees, partners, or customers that we duplicated content on. There's like 5 different academies or universities. Tech Academy, Xamarin University, Imagine Academy. I mean, it was just kind of on and on and on. We're literally rowing in 30+ directions. How do we unify our approach to this, but make it that 10x better? So one of the key things that, there's a set of companies that do stuff like Pluralsight or, those sets that it's learn by watching, which is, there's a video, and I'm going to watch all 4 hours of the video, and that's how I learn. We were going to do something different. We're going to learn by doing, right? When we look at people, they learn by doing. They learn by breaking things, right? We're also going to do micro-learning, right? So each task is going to be like 5, 15 minutes, not this really long thing. At the same time, we also want to have learning paths. So if you don't know where to go, here's your guided path through that. Progress tracking. Consistency. This is an area where every team said, well, I have an 8-hour video that I recorded as a user group, and I want to put it on Microsoft Learn. We're not a dumping ground, right? Like, there's a specific content model. There's a specific way that we want to do learning. And that's another area where it's kind of hard, if you will, to get people to learn. Learning Azure in particular, or new services, required you to have a credit card for the free services. And that was too much friction. What could we do to provide what we called a Learn sandbox? You walk up, click a button. Yes, you do have to log in. No credit card. You get a free environment that lets you build the things that the lab has, and it goes away in a couple hours. It's ephemeral. This was, how we make it that much easier, and we really wanted to be the easiest way to learn cloud. We talked about content models before. One of the key things that I'll stress is having an information architect. Ours is Sarah Barrett, and she's phenomenal and really helped drive this project. These are her drawings. And she's an information architect. She's not a developer, but she knows how to understand and structure data. For those of you who are developers, this looks like an ER diagram, right? Which is, I have a learning path. It has a connection to these things called modules, which are more like, you can almost think of a module as like a course. And there's a relationship between this. So a course has specific steps, which we call units, within there. And there's kind of a one-to-many relationship. And that really helped define what are the things that we need to do to build pages on the developer side. And get everybody to agree, this is how we're going to do it. So I can do things like filter all courses for a specific, just beginner, or just IT, or just DevOps, or just security. So here's how it worked coding. So instead of kind of the markdown for actual steps, the actual content is still markdown. But now we needed a new way to basically build these pages. And you can think of this almost like a JSON database, or in this case, a YAML database, which is, these are all the key value fields. We have things like, hey, a title can't be blank. An MS date has to be a date time, and so on and so forth. And using this, you can build that page by saying, hey, page.title is going to go here. Page.levels, roles, products, those are all going to be tagged. So I'm actually going to include them all up here in a list. Right? So it allowed a kind of that representation. The team can work on the template. The other team can work on the data model. And we're kind of unblocked. And this is another area where we need a lot of microservices. Right? So progress, profile, hierarchy, sandbox, and so on. And the same kind of learning environment. And the point is, this is all static HTML, just like we saw before, the HTML fragments. But we're calling dynamic services. A couple other things. We saw 2 examples here. I did want to just call them out. Try.net is stateless. So every request, compute stuff and returns. Compute stuff and returns. Azure Cloud Shell is actually stateful. So if you're looking for kind of ways that you think about for building apps. OK, let's get into demos. Give this a second. OK. So this is an example learning path. And you can see we have tags. We have all the different modules or courses that we can do. And you can do these step by step. I have the connect an app to Azure storage one that I've done before. You can look at kind of the steps within here. And there's metadata across all these 3. And these things called exercises, I'm going to see if my sandbox is available. Again, you can choose kind of your programming language here. I'm going to wait for that to finish loading. Come on, shell. This is my sandbox, which I activated about 2 hours ago. And we only let you have 4 per day, primarily for security and a couple other things that we did there. So you aren't Bitcoin mining. OK, so not you, this wonderful crowd. It's those other people, or that Damian Brady guy. OK, so this, by the way, is real code. So we can build our app here, right? .NET, new console. And I'm just kind of following along there. And I'll just call it photo sharing app 2. I don't know. We'll go with that. This is going to go. And by the way, the Cloud Shell has .NET installed. It has Node installed. It has Java installed. We could clone a project and effectively use this as a cheap coding environment. So I'm going to do code dot and go into our photo sharing app 2. Whoa, I'm writing code. Awesome. For int I equals 0, I is less than 10, I plus. You guys are like my visual linters, so if I'm doing something wrong. OK, so, and hello, NDC. All right, so I'm going to click File, Save. And I can just exit this. It's kind of one example. And what did we say? CD photo sharing app 2. I did get the achievement for this, by the way. And I'm just going to say .NET run. Come on, baby. Is anybody so nervous? OK. So while this is actually running, hey, all right. Wow, I can do a for loop. Whoa. But if you're learning, like, how do we just reduce the barriers to do that? So I'm going to scroll down here and go to the next step here. And just copy paste this example. And the one thing it is looking for is a name. So let's say my live demo. And I'm going to click enter. Now, a couple things I really want to call out. We are dynamically changing that massive GUID is the sandbox we built. So we actually tokenize the code samples. So that way you can copy paste even easier. Right? So it's like, I know that you have access. I've given you permission to the sandbox that goes away. You can log into the Azure portal. You can do this code sample inside Visual Studio Code or whatever product service that you want. You actually have access to it for 4 hours. And we're going to change the sample to make it reusable. Now, the other thing that we did was, how do we check your work? A lot of times, people in learning sites, they have multiple choice quizzes, which we do. But wouldn't it be cool if we could actually check your work? So what we do is we walk up to that subscription that we have access to, And again, it's a separate subscription. That way, in case you delete everything, you're not deleting production, right? Happened. You click check your work. And only if you actually wrote your code correctly do you get the achievement, right? That's cool. We're all using Azure Resource Manager. Here are the steps that we want to do. We're validating whether you've done it correctly, and then we unlock the Chivo. OK, so we have a few minutes left. I do want to talk about some of the things that we learned and one of the other key areas that we can do here. All right, so JAMStack is revolutionary. It really is the best way to do a number of things. There's so many times when you can just get away with having JSON and YAML as your database in GitHub, as opposed to paying for SQL Server when you don't necessarily need it or when you're not changing data that much. And even then, like I said, we're changing millions of docs, and we're doing millions of releases, and it still scales for our specific needs. Another key area is, while we talk about technology, if you're doing this, you could build your own documentation site with localization, with interactive components in a one-day hackathon and make it that much better, put it all on GitHub. And the key thing is people are going to be like, well, why are we doing this? Show them the data on why people care about this and why it's important. And sometimes it's important for external customers, but the most ignored developers are inside the firewall, which is I have to take a dependency on this team. They don't have any documentation. I'm looking through their code. And of course, every other team is an idiot, right? So the more you can help each other, the better you can build kind of that community of helping each other. There's a learning curve for GitHub, Git, and Markdown. You shouldn't dismiss this, especially for your writers. The less technical your writers are, like, again, we now have IT pro content for how to set up Microsoft Teams. Those writers aren't necessarily developers. I'll show you some tools that exist that are free that will help there. A couple other things. Our Azure SDK is 6 gigabytes because we continuously change the images and screenshots. The actual content is 50 megs of Markdown, right? So if you have a lot of images, don't put the images inside GitHub. GitHub is a terrible place for binaries in general. It would be great to use a tool like Cloudinary that makes this a lot easier, or your own separate thing. This is one of our lessons learned, where your Git clone now takes like 15 minutes because it's taking all images that you won't need from 2007, where if we just did the 50 megs, it's, I don't know, under 10 seconds. 10 minutes versus 10 seconds. And Sudeep did this great paper on it, but unfortunately we didn't get approval to do it. I mentioned some of these before. And also sometimes good enough is good enough. The time to read calculation, I think it's like number of words divided by a fraction. It's good enough. We didn't have to build an AI model that tracks people's progress to do this stuff. It's good enough. And I think we've adjusted it maybe once. Always assume people are going to misuse your stuff when you're building a platform. How do you do that? People started adding HTML and CSS and broke a bunch of our accessibility tools. Find guardrails to basically sanitize anything they do. Content lifecycle. So those old versions of Visual Studio are on this thing, docs.microsoft.com, previous versions. No index, no follow. You can still search when you're in previous versions, but that way Google and the Visual Studio 2012 problem, where that thing has awesome Google juice, goes away. Sweat the details. So how we organize types in the left TOC. Performance is a fantastic detail. Inclusive design, and so on. And docs and learn are a team sport. Again, where we started was 30 different websites or even more. No automation, no anything. And this is kind of where we are now. Cultural change at Microsoft, isolation to openness, stepping up their game. And even just simple things like our Twitter account, which, by the way, has double the number of Twitter followers than I do, which is sad. People low-key love it. And that's Dan Delamarski and Sheer Goldberg, right? And just people, when we made the PowerShell samples, this is such a cool feature. You're making it way too practical these days. Brilliant idea. Interactive docs are simply next level, right? This is really powerful, and it's a lot easier than you can imagine. OK, so resources. I'll put this up. I mentioned the static site generators. This is the JAMStack homepage. This is the scoreboard. If you want to see all the different static site generators that exist and how many stars, what languages they use. On the left side, what's the programming language that they use? And then on the right side is what's the template language. So depending on what you want to do, you can kind of pick. And then I mentioned the syntax highlighter, Duncan's project, our docs authoring pack, which makes it really easy, mdoc. Doctainers, which is the easiest way to get reference for all languages that Den does as well. And the last thing I wanted to show you was, while we close, is just a quick demo, because people say, I don't know how to use GitHub, or I don't want to learn Markdown. There are tools that make this really easy. Right? So I'm using, this is Netlify CMS. I'm going to add a new doc article. It adds a title, Hello World has never been so hard to spell. OK, and this is rich text, right? This is my title, list, right? So you don't need to know Markdown to do this. Ooh, right? But if you want to, you get a preview on the right that you can actually, this is customizable, so you could apply your own skin. Or if you really do like using Markdown, you can switch between these views. Now, the key here, we're going to click Save. This is nothing more than what they call headless CMS. It's a static page that uses JavaScript to write to GitHub. So what we've just done is we've built a pull request. Did I need to do and know all the knowledge of what a pull request is or how to build one? No. Me as my content team, and this is another area, it has a Kanban board where you can see what are the workflow entries, and those are all the entries saved. And I'm able to see kind of the editorial workflow, and this should have the one I just launched in. And again, it's logging onto my account. Underneath the covers, this is doing nothing more than doing writes and pull requests to a repo. Right? So I see pull requests used to be 4 and 5. I just built this 34 seconds ago. It does all of this stuff for me. So if you have folks that are looking, GitHub's too hard, GitHub's not for me, use the power of GitHub and use our front end to make it really easy. And you're able to easily, this is going to be the hardest part, dragging, dropping that article and publishing the new article. And that publishing a new article means something to editorial. For us, it means we're taking a PR and merging it into master. Right? Underneath the covers, we didn't have to worry about it. And you can add all the wonderful things that you want there. Incredibly powerful and totally open source. So I just wanted to end and say thank you all for attending. Appreciate it. I'll be around for questions as well. And we're passing a tip jar. It's called green squares that I think you put in the bottom. And every time I get to work another day at Microsoft. So please put those in there. Thank you all.